Thank you for that question, first of all. It's very generous for you to return to a book now that feels kind of old. But I would say, my research interests have actually been pretty consistently the same, which has been to try to think about what kind of capitalism produces both racial capitalism, as we understand it in the United States, meaning a capitalism that was reliant on settler dispossession and slavery and its afterlives, and produced what we might understand as the colonial mode of production, to cite Bipan Chandra, in places like South Asia, but the rest of the planet, really. And so I've always been curious about that historical condition in which colonialism and race on two different parts of the planet that are not studied together in the United States actually constitute the primary social forces that I encountered when I migrated to the US. One I encountered, which is the kind of afterlife of slavery and the long histories of Asian exclusion laws and so forth. And one was the source of my history, but also unpresent in US society, which is the long history of British colonialism in South Asia and anti-colonial struggles and the kind of post-colonial world. In that milieu, I was particularly interested in the question of queerness and gender, and how it was that one could slip out, as it were, of existing paradigms of reality by desiring the wrong object, by identifying with the wrong gender, by failing to enact kinship properly, that intense feeling of derealization, which actually didn't, unlike the derealization that you get when you move to the US as an Indian and lose any sense of post-colonial history, at least you can go into the library and find those histories. But when you were in the 90s and 80s, this was really when you're queer, that derealization was not a impediment merely of US nationalism, but it went further. And so I've always been curious about those questions. Sorry this is going so long. I also have always come to academia as a site of social transformation, because that's what I needed it to be for me to live. And I always wanted to be a space for others to have that ability to also find in academia the tools to live unsanctioned or unauthorized lives, oftentimes unauthorized by academia itself. And that always requires you to extend yourself outside of academia and into social movements, into communities of change, into communities that support your survival and your forms of pleasure and joy. And so in a lot of ways, Freedom with Violence was a combination of both going to Columbia University to think those questions and also having to step outside of Columbia University and go into communities of activism, but also diasporic communities of South Asians, queer South Asians, for joy and pleasure. And the book is in some ways multidisciplinary because that's what it required to live. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think that the question of why we choose a particular set of erotic attachments over sort of normative requirements, who chooses which is one I really it always it's something I stay up thinking about. When does somebody choose the erotic attachment to queer sexuality, and when does someone choose the erotic attachment to normative conventions? particularly when those conventions give you things like kinship, maybe children, things that you don't imagine as viable or possible outside of them. And for me, ironically, though I grew up in the U.S. mostly, I had a few years in 6th and 7th grades going to school in India, and I was born in India and raised in India as a baby. And the U.S. was a very homophobic world. In my elementary school, I was constantly beat up in my elementary school. When I went to India and studied, I went to boarding school in a place called Rishi Valley. That's where I had all of my first queer experiences. So for me, it was actually going back home or going to India that I became fully intellectually myself. I woke up intellectually, but I also woke up sexually. And so queerness was very dear to me as also a place that I associated with my happiest self. And I think that was when I came back to the US. The AIDS crisis was just beginning. This was 1982. And I somehow both identified with the vulnerability and deep mortality of people who were living with AIDS as a story that was true for me as well, and felt compelled that the joy that I also felt around sexuality, queer sexuality, was worth being that kind of vulnerable subject. So that's kind of how my biography of queerness happened when there were very few. This is a time when there were very few Desis who were queer. Maybe you count them on your hand in the entire North America. We would talk to people in Britain, and we'd talk to random 3 people in Bombay who were running Bombay Dost or something, just because there were so few people at that time publicly. And then I think those experiences really disorganizing where we think queerness comes from, really disorganizing the idea that vulnerability is going to produce abjection rather than identification. Those are the kinds of biographical elements that I think entered into my book, and that I tried to pursue in a scholarly way as well. So it's the work on vernacular for me is actually very new and emergent, and I'm very excited about it. I'll give you some sense of where I'm at with it now, but I'm excited to learn from sharing work and hearing people's responses where the idea could go. Vernaculars have oftentimes been used to talk about language communities and language groups that are in different ways distanced from a national language or an official language, but that persist precisely because they are useful languages. And the root of vernacular, verna, in the Latin is the same word as use. So there's some people think of vernaculars richly, I think, as kind of use values, meaning they operate primarily because people need them, because people transact them, because social life occurs in them, and in that way they are both useful to official languages and to the official state, and also problematic for the state. And so there's a kind of flexibility or plasticity to vernaculars that offers us a different model, I think, of opposition than those that we get when we think something like dominant and counter-dominant, or dominator and oppressor, oppressed. So I was really taken with the vernacular also not only as a linguistic concept, but as a concept to designate material culture. So I think, vernacular is really important to architecture and urban planning, and different material sciences, where they're looking at the ways that people do or make things, whether it's housing, cuisine, all the elements that furnish life, without formal training, without institutions. So meaning without, if you imagine architecture, without the abstraction of being a trained architect who can look at blueprints and build from the print. These are people who know how to build, but don't know how to look at a blueprint per se. These are knowledges that are shared, that are local. So I'm really interested in the vernacular as what we might think of as alternative ways of getting things done. If official languages argue that they are always interested in the production of life, vernaculars show you the limits of those kinds of organized abstract modalities and give us a sense of their own capacities to get things done otherwise. And to get them done through the transmission of vernacular histories to one another, through the connection between knowing how to build something and the memories of the person who taught you how to build that thing. It's a worldliness in that sense, but it's not world making because it's always also limited and restricted. The whole point of a vernacular is its regionality. They can interface with other vernaculars, but they don't seek to abstract upon other vernaculars the way official languages seek. So I'm really interested in that model of kind of social relation, we might even call it relationality, that the vernacular offers us. Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think that is in reference to an essay I wrote on uh, using asylum law to recognize LGBTQ migrants from Pakistan as a persecuted social group, and to grant them legal status in the United States. And in that essay, I'm trying to interrogate that narrative of needing human rights law to protect oneself from, to some degree, one's own natal country. And I interrogate it by asking us to think about who's applying for asylum and why they're applying. And oftentimes these are people who are applying for asylum because there's no other way for them to get legal status after arriving into the United States. And oftentimes they've come to the United States because of a unstable political economy in Pakistan that is created significantly by Pakistan being a client state for the United States since the 1950s. So in the case of sexuality in particular, General Zia, who instituted the Sharia law on top of the existing British criminal code, was very much chosen by the U.S. and was an effect of the U.S. funding of Pakistan, that he was able to have such a strong hand on Pakistan society, or his policies and administration, and start the general Islamicization of society, precisely as a promise to the U.S. to continue criminalizing communism. So in that context, when someone's applying for asylum to the U.S., human rights law is almost being used by the U.S. to forget or absent these conditions of U.S. empire that actually produced the petitioner. So rather than affirm the law, I think the goal is to affirm the contradiction of the petitioner's arrival to the law. that they had to arrive at the law because U.S. imperial policies were going to produce it. One of my advisor, Gayatri Spivak, used to say, all roads lead to Rome, and that's clearly the case here. Queer South Asian migration from Pakistan was going to arrive into the US, and when it arrives and it petitions for human rights status because it has no other mechanism to get legal residence, because at that time marriage was not even a viable option, let alone HIV status was also negated your possibility of getting it, you came to the law to name its contradiction. And we can use law in that manner to actually surface the imperial histories that bring us to law's front door, rather than to abet the use of human rights to continue to forget the conditions of U.S. empire and to position the U.S. as an enforcer of a kind of universal civilizational set of values, which has been its historical mechanism for producing empire. Yeah. Thank you for that question. It goes back to my first answer, which is academia has played a significant role in the diminishment of marginalized people's lives, and a significant role in making available non-normative communities to the violence of the state, making the violence of the state appear as socially good violence when it's being used against non-normative people. And it was academia that makes that violence look like ethical or socially good violence. And so for me, joining academia meant also having to be responsible to the communities that have oftentimes been the means of academic knowledge, and have even been the sites in which academics gain their knowledge and steal knowledge and commodify knowledge, but are never the inheritors of knowledge, are not recognized as such, but also of the world that we ought to be building from the knowledges that these communities organize themselves through. And so whether those are histories or memories or knowledge. And so I've really spent a lot of time organizing, because I think it's important to try to repair the long history of I was going to say betrayal, but that's how I would narrate it. The long history of appropriation is probably more accurate between the university and marginalized worlds if we want the university to be a different kind of apparatus. And that means that you have to do a lot of work with communities to gain their trust. You need to gain their trust all the time. You will slow down sometimes in academic production, because if you produce writing about your organizing, you will lose the trust of the people you're organizing with. There are times when people who are organizing with you want you to write, and you write with them and for them, and you write what they want you to write, whether those are petitions to the state or other things. And there are times when they don't want you to write. And there are times where you have to ask yourself if writing about the work is taking you away from the work. So I like to keep a tension between the writing, scholarly writing, and organizing, and not actually have them line up. And I'm getting a little bit more comfortable, because I've had now years of being trusted, with saying more about the organizing in academic spaces, but I think for a long time I would even refrain from that. So I don't list it on my CV, I don't talk about it, I don't write about it, and I think that that's the work we have to do to start regaining the legitimacy in communities that have been so often appropriated through false agreements between the university and themselves.